She was the enemy's daughter, traded to settle her father's treason. But in the Duke's bed, she discovered that vengeance burns hotter than hate. Before we continue, if this story has already drawn you in, I invite you to support the channel by liking this video and subscribing. It allows these quiet Victorian tales to reach others who value depth and timeless storytelling. And if you're willing, do leave a comment telling us where you're listening from. It is always a pleasure to see how far these stories travel. The thunderstorm had raged for 3 nights when the Duke's solicitor arrived at Lafayette Manor in the parish of St. Giles, London. Through the rain-streaked window of her father's study, 21-year-old Margaret Lafayette watched the imposing black carriage bearing the Howard crest come to a halt outside their crumbling townhouse. Her heart hammered against her ribs, not with fear but with fury. She'd known this moment would arrive, had watched her father's desperation grow with each passing week, but knowing hadn't dulled the blade of betrayal. Inside the study, the air felt thick enough to choke on. Her father, William Lafayette, sat hunched behind his mahogany desk like a cornered animal, the man who'd once commanded rooms now reduced to trembling hands and hollow eyes. The candles guttered in their holders, casting grotesque shadows across walls lined with books he'd never read and honors he'd never earned. Somewhere in the house, the servants moved quietly, already mourning a mistress who wasn't yet gone. The solicitor entered without ceremony, water dripping from his severe black coat onto the Persian rug. He was exactly what Margaret had imagined, cold precision wrapped in expensive tailoring, eyes like chips of ice that catalogued everything with the dispassion of an undertaker measuring a corpse. The leather portfolio he carried might as well have been a coffin. Mr. Lafayette. He didn't waste breath on pleasantries as he placed the documents on the desk between them. Shall we conclude His Grace's business? William gestured weakly toward a chair, his voice barely above a whisper. Please, sit. That won't be necessary. The solicitor remained standing, our executioner who preferred his work done efficiently. The terms are explicit. Your daughter will enter the household of His Grace, Thomas Howard, Duke of Norfolk, at his estate in the county of Norfolk. She will serve as personal attendant to His Grace. Duration of service, until such time as the Duke deems your debt satisfied. Compensation, your life, Mr. Lafayette, and the stay of charges of high treason against the Crown. Accommodations and appropriate attire will be provided at the Duke's discretion. Should the young lady attempt to flee, or should you interfere in any manner, the full weight of the charges will proceed, and the scaffold at Tyburn awaits you both. The words fell like a judge's gavel, final and absolute, each syllable sealing Margaret's fate. She had known the terms. Her father had confessed everything 3 weeks ago in this very room, weeping like a child. But hearing them spoken aloud, rendered in such clinical brutality, made them inescapably real. Personal attendant. The euphemism hung in the air like smoke. Everyone knew what it meant. She wasn't being sent as a governess or a lady's companion. She was being delivered to Thomas Howard's bed, a living penance for sins she hadn't committed, payment in flesh for her father's treachery. The girl is of age. The solicitor's gaze finally landed on Margaret where she stood by the window, assessing her as one might appraise livestock at market. His eyes traveled from her rain-dampened auburn hair to the modest dress that suddenly felt far too thin. His Grace was assured she is intact. The question burned like acid. Margaret felt her cheeks flame, but she lifted her chin and met his stare with all the aristocratic pride generations of Lafayettes had bred into her bones. If she was to be sold like chattel, she would at least meet her buyer's representative as an equal. I am 21, she said, her voice steady despite the rage churning in her gut. And I am standing right here. You may address your questions to me directly. The solicitor's mouth twitched, whether in amusement or irritation, she couldn't tell. His Grace will appreciate your spirit. Though I suspect not for long. He turned back to William, dismissing her as quickly as he'd noticed her. You have 1 hour to prepare your daughter for departure. She may bring one trunk. Nothing of value, His Grace will provide everything she requires. Everything except freedom, Margaret thought bitterly. Everything except dignity. Everything except a choice. The carriage journey to Norfolk had taken 2 days, each mile carrying Margaret further from everything she'd known and closer to a fate she couldn't yet name. When Howard Hall finally emerged from the mist like a fortress carved from shadow and stone, she understood why they called Thomas Howard the Iron Duke. The estate sprawled across the countryside with brutal elegance, all sharp angles and unyielding granite, surrounded by walls that had withstood centuries of siege. This was not a home. It was a stronghold. They brought her directly to his study, no pretense of hospitality or gentle introduction. The room smelled of leather and smoke, masculine and unforgiving. Thomas Howard stood with his back to her, silhouetted against the massive window that overlooked his domain. When he finally turned, Margaret's breath caught despite herself. The man was younger than she'd imagined, perhaps 35, with dark hair touched silver at the temples and eyes the color of a winter storm. Handsome in the way that sharp blades are beautiful, cold, precise, deadly. So you're William Lafayette's spawn. His voice was cultured but carried an edge that could draw blood. He circled her slowly, a predator assessing prey. You have his eyes. That same weak, calculating look. I am Margaret Lafayette, she said, lifting her chin. Not his spawn. Not his shadow. Whatever sins he committed are his alone. Are they? Thomas stopped directly before her, close enough that she could see the fury banked behind his controlled expression. Tell me, Miss Lafayette, did you enjoy the wealth built on stolen fortunes? The gowns purchased with money meant for widows and orphans? The comfort of a home maintained while good families starved? The accusation struck like physical blows, but Margaret held her ground. I knew nothing of his dealings. Ignorance is not innocence. He moved to his desk, poured 2 glasses of wine with deliberate care. He offered her one. When she hesitated, his smile turned cruel. Drink, Miss Lafayette. You'll find I'm not so barbaric as to poison you. Where would be the satisfaction in that? She took the glass, their fingers brushing. Even through her gloves, the contact sent electricity up her arm. She drank, meeting his eyes over the rim, refusing to show fear. Here are the terms of your servitude, Thomas continued, settling into his chair with the ease of a man accustomed to absolute power. You will live in the East Wing. You will take your meals when and where I dictate. You will wear what I provide. You will go nowhere without my permission. And you will come to my bed when I summon you. Heat flooded Margaret's face, but she didn't look away. And if I refuse? Then your father hangs, and you'll watch from the scaffold before they place the noose around your own lovely neck. He leaned forward, elbows on his desk. Make no mistake, Miss Lafayette. You are here because I want William to suffer, knowing his daughter pays for his sins in the most intimate way possible. Every night you spend in my bed, Every morning you wake beside the man whose family your father destroyed. That is his punishment. You are simply the instrument." "I am not an instrument." Margaret set down her glass with enough force to make it ring. "I am a woman. And whatever you do to me, Your Grace, remember this, you may own my circumstances, but you will never own me." For the first time, something flickered in Thomas Howard's eyes. Surprise, perhaps. Or recognition. He stood, moved toward her until only inches separated them. She could feel the heat radiating from his body, smell the sandalwood and smoke that clung to his clothes. "We'll see," he murmured, his breath warm against her ear. "Hatred is a form of intimacy, Miss Lafayette. By the time I'm done with you, you'll understand that better than anyone." The East Wing was beautiful in the way that prisons could be beautiful, luxurious but suffocating. Margaret's rooms were appointed with silk wallpaper, velvet curtains, and furniture that likely cost more than her father's entire estate. But the windows were high and narrow, and when she tested the door to the corridor, she found it locked from the outside. She spent the first morning exploring her cage. The bedchamber, a dressing room filled with gowns in deep jewel tones that fit her perfectly, he'd had her measurements, had planned this imprisonment down to the last detail. A sitting room with books she had no concentration to read. And finally, a small door she'd almost missed, hidden behind a tapestry depicting some ancient Howard victory in battle. The door opened onto a narrow passageway, servants' corridors probably, the kind great houses honeycombed through their walls. Margaret hesitated only a moment before stepping through. If she was to be trapped here, she would at least know the dimensions of her prison. The passage twisted and turned, lit by occasional shafts of light from slots in the outer wall. She passed doors that likely led to other rooms, heard the distant sounds of servants going about their duties. Then the corridor opened into a wider space, a forgotten gallery judging by the dusty portraits lining the walls. Margaret walked slowly past stern-faced Howards, each one looking more forbidding than the last, until she reached the end where a single painting hung draped in black cloth. Something about it called to her. She glanced over her shoulder, still alone, and reached up to pull the covering aside. The portrait showed a young woman, perhaps 20, with auburn hair and laughing eyes. She wore the fashion of 15 years past, her hand resting on the shoulder of a small boy who gazed up at her with obvious adoration. The nameplate read, "Eleanor Howard, Duchess of Norfolk, and Thomas Howard, heir." But it was the violence done to the canvas that made Margaret gasp. Someone had slashed the painting repeatedly, deep gouges that destroyed the Duchess's face and body while leaving the child untouched. The rage in those cuts was palpable, almost alive. This was the source of Thomas's pain, the wound that had festered into hatred. "You shouldn't be here." Margaret spun. Thomas stood in the entrance to the gallery, his expression darker than she'd yet seen it. He moved toward her with controlled fury, each step deliberate. "The servant said you'd vanished from your rooms. I should have known you'd find the one place I forbade even my own staff to enter." "I didn't know," Margaret said, but she didn't step away from the portrait. "Who was she?" "My mother." The words came out clipped, sharp as broken glass. "Dead these 15 years. Murdered, though the official record calls it an accident. I'm sorry." "Don't." He reached past her, his arm brushing hers, and tore the black cloth completely away. In the fuller light, Margaret could see the painting had once been magnificent. "Your father was her lover. Did you know that?" Oh, he was only a secretary then, nobody important. But he seduced her, convinced her to steal from my father's coffers to fund his schemes. When the theft was discovered, she threw herself from the North Tower rather than face the consequences. Margaret's stomach turned. I swear to you, I knew nothing. She left me. Thomas's voice cracked, just barely. I was 10 years old, and she chose death over staying with me. Because of William Lafayette's poison. So yes, Miss Lafayette, you will pay for his sins. Every day you remain here is a reminder that the Howards survived what your family tried to destroy. He grabbed her arm, not roughly but firmly, and pulled her from the gallery. Margaret had thought Thomas would summon her immediately to his bed, but 3 days passed in silence. She remained confined to the East Wing, meals delivered by tight-lipped servants who wouldn't meet her eyes. The isolation was its own form of torture, leaving her alone with her thoughts and the growing dread of what awaited. On the 4th evening, a maid finally came to prepare her. The girl, barely 16, helped Margaret into a gown of deep crimson silk that left her shoulders bare and clung to her curves in a way that felt more like exposure than elegance. His Grace requests your presence at dinner, the maid said softly. In the formal dining room. So not the bedchamber, not yet. Margaret didn't know whether to feel relieved or more anxious. She followed the maid through corridors she hadn't seen before, past rooms that spoke of wealth accumulated over generations. Finally, they reached a dining room that could have seated 50 but was set intimately for 2, all glittering crystal and candlelight. Thomas stood when she entered, his own evening clothes impeccable. He pulled out her chair with impeccable courtesy, as though she were an honored guest rather than his captive. The contradiction made her head spin. You look lovely, he said, and it didn't sound like a compliment. Red suits you. The color of sin and warfare. How appropriate, then, Margaret replied, accepting the wine a servant poured. Since I'm apparently guilty of both in your eyes. A muscle ticked in his jaw, but he took his own seat. The first course arrived, oysters, naturally, the not-so-subtle suggestion making Margaret's cheeks warm. She ate one deliberately, holding his gaze. Tell me, Your Grace, is this elaborate dinner theatre meant to make me more comfortable before you claim what my father sold? Or is it simply another form of torment? Can it not be both? He selected his own oyster, the gesture somehow obscene. I find anticipation enhances all of life's pleasures. And punishments. You speak as though those are the same thing. In my experience, they often are. They continued through the courses, the conversation dancing around the tension that crackled between them. Margaret found herself studying him, the way his hands moved when he spoke, the intelligence in his eyes, the barely contained intensity he wore like armor. Your mother was beautiful, she said finally, unable to contain the thought any longer. In the portrait, before it was destroyed. Thomas set down his fork carefully. I did that. The day of her funeral. I was so angry I couldn't breathe, couldn't think. I took my father's cavalry sword and slashed her face from the canvas because I couldn't slash it from my memory. The raw honesty startled her. You must have loved her very much. I idolized her. Which made the betrayal infinitely worse. He drained his wine, signaled for more. Tell me something, Miss Lafayette. Your father, do you love him? The question was a trap, she could feel it. He's my father. That's not an answer. Margaret considered lying, but what was the point? No. I don't love him. I don't even know if I ever did, truly. He was always distant, always scheming. I was simply another piece on his board. Then we have something in common. Thomas leaned back, studying her with new interest. We're both casualties of William Lafayette's ambitions. That doesn't mean I'll meekly accept being your instrument of revenge. No, he agreed, and for the first time, she saw a hint of something other than cold fury in his expression. I don't believe you will. Which makes this infinitely more interesting. The servants cleared the final course. Margaret knew this was the moment. Soon he would stand, would extend his hand, would lead her to his bedchamber. Her heart hammered against her ribs. But Thomas simply stood and bowed, the gesture almost mocking in its formality. Thank you for a stimulating evening, Miss Lafayette. I find I'm not quite ready to conclude our negotiations. You may return to your rooms. Confusion flooded through her, followed by something that felt dangerously close to disappointment. I don't understand. Neither do I, he admitted, his smile sharp and self-deprecating. Perhaps that's the problem. Good night, Margaret. He'd used her name. She turned, aware of his eyes on her as she left the dining room. Behind her, she heard glass shatter, his wine glass, perhaps, thrown against the wall. The sound followed her all the way back to the East Wing, along with the unsettling realization that she'd actually enjoyed their dinner, despite everything. This was far more dangerous than simple hatred. Margaret woke to urgent voices in the corridor outside her rooms. She sat up, pulling her wrapper tight as the door burst open. Thomas strode in, still dressed from the evening but disheveled in a way she hadn't seen before, his cravat loosened and hair disarrayed. Get dressed. Quickly. His voice was clipped, all business. We have perhaps 10 minutes. What's happening? Someone's breached the estate. 3 men, possibly more. My guards are searching, but until we know if this is a robbery or something more targeted, I'm not leaving you alone in the East Wing. He turned his back, giving her privacy. Now, Margaret. Move. She didn't argue. She shed her nightgown and pulled on the simplest dress she could find, fingers clumsy with adrenaline. Done. Thomas took her arm and guided her swiftly through the corridors. Not to his bedchamber as she'd expected, but to a room she hadn't known existed, a small interior chamber with no windows, hidden behind a bookcase in his private study. A safe room, she realized. The space was barely large enough for a narrow bed and a single chair. Stay here. Don't open the door for anyone but me. He moved to leave, but she caught his sleeve. What if they're here for me? What if my father sent them? Something flickered in Thomas's eyes, surprised that she'd considered it, perhaps. Then they'll have to go through me first. Why? Why would you protect me when you hate everything I represent? He looked at her for a long moment, and in the flickering candlelight, she saw confusion cross his features. I'm beginning to ask myself the same question. Then he was gone, the bookcase sliding shut behind him. Margaret heard the locking gauge, sealing her in. She sat on the edge of the bed, heart racing, and waited. The minutes stretched. She heard nothing beyond the heavy door, no gunshots, no shouts. Just oppressive silence. She paced the small space, 5 steps in each direction, her mind conjuring increasingly terrible scenarios. Thomas injured, captured, dead. And what would become of her then? Finally, after what felt like hours but was probably only 40 minutes, she heard the lock disengage. The bookcase swung open. Thomas stepped through, a cut above his left eye bleeding sluggishly, but otherwise unharmed. It's over. They were common thieves, probably saw the coaches arriving and thought the household distracted. They're in the custody of the magistrate now. He sat heavily in the chair, suddenly looking exhausted. You can return to your rooms. But Margaret didn't move. She found herself taking the cloth from the washstand, dampening it, and before she could question the impulse, she was kneeling beside his chair, reaching up to clean the blood from his face. Thomas went very still. What are you doing? You're bleeding. Her voice came out softer than intended. And despite everything, you just risked your life to keep me safe. Let me do this. He didn't pull away. She worked carefully, wiping the blood, checking the wound. Their faces were inches apart, his breath warm on her cheek. This close, she could see flecks of green in his grey eyes, the faint scar on his jaw, the way his pulse jumped in his throat. Margaret, he said, and her name in his voice did something dangerous to her equilibrium. This would be much easier if you were simply the monster I'd built in my mind. If you were your father's creature through and through. Would it? She didn't move away. Or would it be emptier? A hollow victory over someone who deserved it. I wanted you to deserve it, he admitted roughly. I wanted you to be everything I imagined so I could hate you purely, completely. And now? Instead of answering, Thomas reached up and caught her hand, the one still holding the cloth to his wound. His fingers wrapped around hers, warm and strong. Now I find myself lying awake wondering what you're thinking in your rooms down the hall. I find myself staging elaborate dinners just to hear you argue with me. I find myself protecting you when I should be destroying me, she finished. Yes. The word was barely a whisper. Margaret set down the cloth. She should move away, should retreat to the safety of distance and animosity. Instead, she found herself leaning closer, her free hand coming to rest on his chest. She could feel his heart racing beneath her palm, as rapid as her own. Thomas, she said, testing his name on her tongue. I think we're both being destroyed. Just not in the way you planned. He pulled her closer with the hand still wrapped around hers, his other arm coming around her waist. When his lips met hers, there was nothing gentle about it, all the weeks of tension, fear, and unwilling fascination combusting into pure heat. Margaret responded without thinking, her fingers fisting in his shirt, her body pressing against his. This was madness. This was betrayal of everything she'd sworn to herself. But as Thomas lifted her, carried her to the narrow bed, as their bodies finally came together in the desperate tangle of desire and anger and something neither of them wanted to name, Margaret couldn't bring herself to care. In the small hours before dawn, she lay in his arms, both of them silent. The walls between them hadn't crumbled, but they'd cracked. And through those cracks, something far more dangerous than hatred was bleeding through. If you're enjoying these Victorian stories, please like the video and subscribe for more. And do tell me in the comments, where are you listening from today? The letter arrived a week later, delivered by a man Margaret recognized with a sinking heart, one of her father's associates. The servant who brought it to her rooms wore a disapproving expression, as though Margaret had personally invited this intrusion into His Grace's household. She broke the seal with trembling hands, already knowing this would change everything. "Dearest Margaret," her father's familiar script began, and she wanted to burn it unread. "I trust you are well and that you have ingratiated yourself into the Duke's household as we discussed. The time has come for you to prove your loyalty to your family. I need information, details of the Duke's financial holdings, his correspondence with the Crown, any evidence of his dealings that might prove useful. Leave what you discover in the false bottom of the third pew at St. Michael's Church during your Sunday attendance. Do not fail in this, Margaret. Your mother's safety depends upon your cooperation." The letter went on, full of justifications and manipulations, but Margaret stopped reading. Her mother. Of course he'd threaten her mother. It was so predictable it almost made her laugh, if hysteria could be called laughter. She looked around her rooms, at the luxury Thomas had provided, and felt sick. Had her father planned this from the beginning? Had the debt, the bargain, all of it been elaborate theatre to place her exactly here, in Thomas's household, in his confidence? In his bed? The thought made her stomach turn. What they'd shared in that small room, what had continued on 3 more nights since, had she betrayed him already simply by being William Lafayette's daughter? And now her father wanted her to complete the betrayal, to prove every terrible thing Thomas believed about her family. Margaret paced her sitting room, the letter burning in her hand. She could show it to Thomas. She should show it to Thomas. But what would he think? That she'd been complicit all along? That every moment between them had been calculated manipulation? And her mother? God, her mother, who'd never been strong, never been able to stand against William's will. If Margaret refused, what would he do to her? A knock at the door interrupted her spiraling thoughts. "Come in." Thomas entered, and the sight of him made her heart clench. He'd grown easier around her these past days, his expression less guarded. Now he smiled, actually smiled, and held up a book. "I found this in the library. You mentioned wanting to read it, so I thought." He stopped, seeing her face. "What's wrong?" Margaret looked at him, this man who'd begun as her enemy, who'd become something she didn't dare name. She thought of her mother, fragile and trapped. She thought of her father, poison in human form. She thought of herself, caught between loyalty and love, between blood and choice. "I received a letter," she said, and held it out. "From my father." Thomas took it, his expression hardening as he read. When he finished, he let it drop to the floor as though it were contaminated. "I see. So this was the plan all along. Seduce me, gain my trust, and ransack my affairs for whatever intelligence William could sell to his next set of victims." "No." Margaret stepped toward him, but he moved back. "Thomas, I swear to you, I knew nothing about this. I never agreed." "Didn't you?" His voice was cold again, all the warmth they'd built evaporating like morning frost. "You're very good, Margaret. I'll give you that. The reluctance, the pride, the way you argued with me, all of it perfectly calculated to make me believe you were different from him." "I am different from him." "Then prove it." He turned to face her fully, and the pain in his eyes was worse than his anger. "Show me the letter" was a surprise. "Show me you choose differently than your father would." "He's threatening my mother." "Of course he is. It's what men like William do. They find the lever that moves you and they push until you break." Thomas moved to the door, paused with his hand on the frame. "I won't lock you in, Margaret. I won't force your choice. But understand, if you betray me, if I find even one document missing, one letter unsealed, you'll discover I can be the monster you initially believed I was." He left, taking all the air in the room with him. Margaret sank onto the settee, the letter at her feet like an accusation. She had to choose her blood or her heart. Her mother or the man she was falling in love with. Safety or truth? She thought of that portrait in the gallery, of Eleanor Howard who'd chosen a man like William Lafayette over her own son. Who'd destroyed everything rather than face the consequences of her choices. Margaret understood now why Thomas had slashed that painting, not just from anger, but from fear. Fear that love always meant betrayal, that trust always ended in abandonment. She would not be Eleanor Howard. She would not be her father's creature. Margaret picked up the letter, walked to the fireplace, and fed it to the flames. She watched the paper blacken and curl, watched her father's words turn to ash. Then she sat down at the small writing desk and began a letter of her own, to her mother, hidden at her sister's estate in Yorkshire, far from William's reach. She would send money, arrange protection, do whatever was necessary to keep her safe. But she would not spy. She would not betray Thomas. Even if it meant declaring war on her own blood. When the letter was sealed, Margaret went to find Thomas. She had a choice to make, and she'd made it. Now she had to hope it wasn't too late. 3 weeks after Margaret burned her father's letter, Lady Catherine Ashford arrived at Howard Hall for the autumn house party Thomas hosted annually. Margaret heard the commotion of her arrival from her rooms, the carriages, the servants rushing about, the bright voice calling out greetings as though she owned the place. Thomas had mentioned the party in passing, his expression carefully neutral. "Several families from the county will attend. You may join us or remain in your rooms, as you prefer." The choice itself was revealing. A month ago, he would have commanded her presence or absence. Now he offered her the decision, though they both knew what it cost him. They'd been circling each other since the night of her father's letter, neither quite able to bridge the distance her choice had created. She'd proven she wouldn't betray him, but trust, once cracked, was hard to rebuild. Margaret chose to attend. If she was to have any future here, hiding in her rooms would accomplish nothing. She dressed carefully in a gown of deep emerald that brought out the color of her eyes. When she entered the drawing room that evening, conversation stuttered. She felt the weight of eyes assessing her, whispers rippling through the assembled guests. They knew she didn't belong here, that she was something other than a proper guest. Thomas stood near the fireplace in conversation with an older gentleman, but his eyes found her immediately. Something flickered in his expression, approval, perhaps, or warning. Then a vision in ice blue silk glided between them, breaking their line of sight. Lady Catherine Ashford was everything Margaret was not, impeccably connected, flawlessly beautiful, and clearly comfortable in Thomas's home. She took his arm with easy familiarity, laughed at something he said, and Margaret felt something dark and unwelcome twist in her chest. Jealousy. How absurd, when she had no claim on him at all. "You must be Miss Lafayette," a voice said at her elbow. Margaret turned to find a woman of perhaps 40, elegantly dressed and watching her with sharp, intelligent eyes. "I'm Lady Sarah Pembroke. I don't believe we've been introduced." "No, my lady. I'm—" Margaret hesitated. What was she? Guest? Servant? Mistress? "I'm staying with His Grace for a time." How diplomatic. Lady Sarah's smile held more knowledge than judgment. "Come, let me introduce you about. The vultures are circling, and you look like you could use an ally." She wasn't wrong. As Lady Sarah guided her through the room, making introductions, Margaret felt the weight of curiosity and condemnation. These people knew who she was, or at least, who her father was. The whispers followed her like a shadow. Dinner was an elaborate affair, and Margaret found herself seated far from Thomas, which was probably for the best. She watched as Lady Catherine commanded his attention, her hand resting on his sleeve just a touch too long, her laughter just a note too bright. She watched as he played the perfect host, charming and attentive, and wondered if she'd imagined the heat between them, the connection. After dinner, as the ladies withdrew and the gentlemen lingered over port, Lady Catherine caught Margaret in the corridor. Up close, she was even more striking, her blonde hair perfectly coiffed, blue eyes cold as winter ice. "Miss Lafayette. How kind of Thomas to take you in after your father's troubles." Her smile was razor-sharp. "Though I confess, I'm puzzled by the arrangement. You're not a governess, are you? Nor a companion? What exactly is your position here?" "I'm His Grace's guest," Margaret said, keeping her voice level. "How fascinating." Catherine stepped closer, her perfume overwhelming. "Because my sources tell me something rather different. They tell me you're William Lafayette's daughter, sold to Thomas to settle your father's debts. They tell me you warm his bed in exchange for his mercy." Heat flooded Margaret's face. "I don't know what your sources claim." "Oh, I don't judge, my dear. Thomas is a man, after all, with a man's appetites. And you're certainly pretty enough." Catherine's expression hardened. "But understand this, Thomas Howard and I have an understanding. Our families have been aligned for generations. When his year of mourning for his late wife ends, he will offer for me. You're a temporary amusement, nothing more." His late wife. Margaret's mind reeled. "I didn't know he'd been married." Catherine's laugh was cruel. "Oh, how delicious. He hasn't told you? Amelia Howard died 3 years ago in childbirth, along with their son. Thomas swore he'd never marry again, but my father and his have other ideas. The Howard line needs an heir, and I'll be the one to provide it." She swept away, leaving Margaret shaken in the corridor. Thomas had been married. Had lost a wife and child. And she'd never known, had never thought to ask about his past beyond his mother's tragedy. What else didn't she know about him? "Don't let Catherine get to you," Lady Sarah said, appearing beside her. "She's been angling for Thomas's title since before Amelia was cold in the ground. He has no interest in marrying her." "How can you be sure?" "Because I've known Thomas since he was a boy. And I've never seen him look at anyone the way he looks at you. Lady Sarah touched her arm gently. "Whatever brought you here, my dear, I don't think it's where you'll stay." But later that night, as Margaret lay alone in her rooms listening to the sounds of the party continuing below, she wasn't so certain. Lady Catherine was right about one thing: Margaret was nobody, nothing. A fallen gentleman's daughter with no prospects and no future. What could she possibly offer Thomas Howard except more scandal and shame? She didn't know that in the drawing room below, Lady Catherine was having a very different conversation with her brother, Lord Ashford. Nor did she know that he was already composing a letter to certain members of the royal court, detailing the scandalous presence of William Lafayette's daughter in the Duke of Norfolk's household. The trap was closing. And Margaret wouldn't know until it was far too late. The summons came a week after the house party ended, delivered by royal courier in the early morning. Margaret was in the library when she heard the commotion, Thomas's raised voice, the sound of breaking glass, then terrible silence. She found him in his study, the letter crumpled in his fist, his face ashen. "Thomas?" She closed the door behind her. "What's happened?" "You need to leave." His voice was hollow. "Today. Now. I'll arrange a carriage to take you to Dover, and a ship from there. France, perhaps, or Italy. Somewhere they can't." "Stop." She moved toward him. "Tell me what's happened." He looked at her then, and the anguish in his eyes made her heart crack. "The Crown knows you're here. Someone informed the King's Council that I'm harboring the daughter of a convicted traitor under my roof. They are summoning me to London to answer charges of treason by association." Margaret felt the floor tilt beneath her feet. "Catherine!" It had to be Catherine. "It doesn't matter who." Thomas moved to the window, his back rigid. "What matters is that I was a fool to keep you here. I knew the risk, and his voice broke. "I have to go to London. I have to face the council. And I can't protect you if you're here when they come." "Then I'll go with you." "Absolutely not." "Thomas." Margaret crossed to him, put her hand on his arm until he turned to face her. "Do you really think running will help? It will only make you look guilty. Make us both look guilty. There is no us, Margaret." But the words lacked conviction. "There can't be. Not now. Liar." She cupped his face in her hands, forcing him to meet her eyes. "There's been an hour since the night you chose to protect me instead of breaking me. Since the night I chose you over my father. We're already damned, Thomas. The only question is whether we face it together or separately. If you come to London with me, if you appear before the council, they could execute you, Margaret. Your father's crimes are capital offences, and you're his blood. Then let them. Let them see that I'm not afraid to stand beside you, to claim whatever this is between us in front of God and the King himself." She pulled his forehead down to rest against hers. "I'm tired of running. I'm tired of shame. If I'm to hang, I'll hang as myself, not as my father's daughter, but as the woman who chose Thomas Howard. Consequences be damned." He kissed her then, fierce and desperate, and she tasted salt, his tears or hers, she couldn't tell. When they finally broke apart, he pulled her close, his arms tight around her. "You're either very brave or very foolish. Probably both. She pressed her face against his chest, breathing him in. "But I'm not leaving you. Not now. Not ever, if you'll have me." "Have you?" His laugh was strangled. "Margaret, I think I've been yours since you stood in my study and told me you were a woman, not an instrument. I was just too much of a coward to admit it." They left for London the next morning, together. The journey took 2 days, and Margaret spent them memorizing the way Thomas's hand felt in hers, the sound of his voice, the weight of his gaze. If these were to be their last days, she would make every moment count. The council chambers were as intimidating as she'd imagined, all dark wood and severe faces, men in elaborate robes who looked at her as though she were something distasteful scraped from their boots. Thomas stood before them with his head high, every inch the Duke, while Margaret sat in the gallery reserved for observers. Lord Chancellor Pemberton read the charges. Harbouring a traitor's daughter. Inappropriate association with a family convicted of crimes against the Crown. Behaviour unbecoming a peer of the realm. Each accusation fell like a stone, building a wall between Thomas and his freedom. "Your Grace," the Lord Chancellor said, his voice dripping with disdain. "How do you answer these charges?" Thomas looked up at Margaret, then held her gaze, and she saw the decision crystallize in his eyes. He was going to do something reckless. Something wonderful and terrible. "I answer," Thomas said clearly, his voice carrying through the chamber, "that I am guilty of every charge. I did harbour Margaret Lafayette in my household. I did associate with her, intimately and extensively. And I would do it all again, because I love her. Because she is the finest woman I have ever known, and her father's sins have nothing to do with her worth." Chaos erupted. The council members shouted over each other, the gallery buzzed with scandal, and Margaret felt tears stream down her face. He'd done it. He declared himself in front of everyone, had chosen her over his title, his safety, everything. But she wouldn't let him sacrifice himself alone. "My lords!" Margaret stood, her voice cutting through the din. "My lords, if you please." The chamber fell silent. Every eye turned to her. "My name is Margaret Lafayette, and I am indeed the daughter of William Lafayette, convicted traitor. But I am also the woman who exposed his most recent treachery." She descended from the gallery, walked to stand beside Thomas. "3 months ago, my father attempted to use me as a spy in His Grace's household. He sent me instructions to steal documents, to betray the Duke's confidence. I refused. If this story has moved you, I invite you to show your support by liking this video and subscribing to the channel. It helps these stories reach others who cherish the elegance and emotion of a bygone age. I would also love to know where you are watching from. Please share your country or city in the comments below.